talk a little bit about your background and how you got, you know, how you got, you know, your ideas and how you came to do this.
Well, like I said, I'm a hate crime survivor. Where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, it's probably as old school as it gets. Carlisle, the town where I grew up in, was the site of the first prototype for all of the Native American schools in our country back in 1890. So when they finished the railroads, that generation of people went to all of the tribes that they could go to that they had organized in their own fashion and brought their children to Carlisle to re-educate them. That's where Jim Thorpe, the big sports star, went to school. So that, you know, I'm not really Buddhist, but because I studied language and I'm really fascinated by that form of preserving teaching. Karmic issues are karmic issues. You know, people deny and ignore and abuse other people's civil and human rights. That ends up adding up, piling up, until people actually sit down and discuss those things and work it out. So my crime actually happened on that war college race. I was only 18, and basically I was overdosed on LSD and was raped to death in that war college race. I woke up somewhere else, and actually I didn't even process any of that happening to me, even physically, much less mentally or emotionally, for like another 7 years.
That's trauma.
Yes, serious trauma.
That's trauma, yeah.
And actually I didn't start processing it until I moved to Europe. So I guess I felt very safe because I was in Holland and Amsterdam and all places. So I felt very safe then. And I actually became a nanny for like 4 years while I was in Amsterdam. So taking care of this family, all of a sudden all that stuff started coming up and all these memories started coming back, and all of a sudden it just hit me and I'm like, oh, that's what happened, you know. And then when I went back to Pennsylvania, probably almost a decade later, my little sister got married. And I found out, because I'm adopted, I came back actually in like 1999 and moved to California because I got in contact with my biological mother. So I went to go meet her in Santa Ana, Costa Mesa, in Orange County, and met her. We spent some time together, but ultimately we went our different ways. But she told me actually that my biological dad grew up in the same town where I grew up in Pennsylvania, but that town is still very segregated. So literally all the African people and all the ethnic people still live on the other side of the train tracks. So when I went to school, there weren't any other black kids, there weren't any brown kids, there was like 2 or 3 Vietnamese kids that were also adopted or imported. So it was I grew up like this. Everywhere I went with my family, I didn't want to see anybody else's reactions. I didn't want to think about how other people were dealing with race. Like I just shut it all out. But when you go through something like that, you can't ignore it anymore. So part of me processing that post-traumatic stress disorder, especially when I was in Europe and I taught myself how to speak and read Dutch, like when you change your language part of your mind, when you start learning on that level, it also is like pushing out your trauma, like poison or something. So it was actually really intense and scary to be in Holland and not in my own country all of a sudden when all this stuff started coming out. So I think right before I left Amsterdam, I decided to go back to the conservatory because one of the side effects of my post-traumatic stress disorder is that I had a kind of compounded aphasia. I don't know if you know what aphasia is. It's when you have severe head trauma. It affects the language center of your brain. So all of a sudden, I went to school to NYU actually for jazz. I'm a singer. I've been singing since I was a little kid. All of a sudden, I couldn't listen to music anymore. It was like some switch got flipped, and every time I would turn on music, it was just chaos. So I forced myself to go to the conservatory in Amsterdam for a year, also studying jazz, voice, but then decided I couldn't do that. Luckily, one of my good friends actually suggested, she heard that there was a professional music theory school in Hair. And I love the 60s, and I love that generation so much just because of their activism. So I said, sure, I'll go to Hair. I've also been doing music theory since I was little too. And it was really cool. It ended up being awesome because I got to meet James Ratto, who's one of the guys that wrote Hair. So those, I think, being in Holland and being away from, or having that remoteness from, American culture and American problems with racism in terms of surviving a hate crime like that, because it wasn't just because I'm, a different color, I'm also gay. So kind of, where I grew up, that was like a triple threat or something. For me, having the opportunity in Holland to kind of reseed the vital part of me in terms of music, in terms of, culture and activism, and teaching myself a new language, I took that with me when I came back to meet my mother. So when I went back to Carlisle to meet my dad, and meet all of my cousins, which is another huge side of my family, I was prepared, actually, to face how outraging it was, actually. One of the hardest things when I went back to Pennsylvania was finding out that a professor at Dickinson College, which is also in Carlisle, as well as Dickinson School of Law, who was an African-American professor of African Studies, he also had been overdosed by his students on LSD as a prank. And they never pressed charges, they never did anything to these young men. Dickinson tends to be called the Ivy League school for rejects, actually. If you don't get into Harvard or Princeton or Yale, then you can still afford to go to Dickinson. But that attitude is very, very prevalent there. So that poor man, actually, when I met him, he had been wandering around as a almost homeless person for like 4 or 5 years before I had gone to meet my dad. And actually everybody in town, including my family, which was the most disturbing, like my aunt, they all called him Professor Pisspants, because whatever those kids did to him, he would be walking down the street carrying his briefcase still, and they would just say stuff to him and he'd pee himself. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, it's like almost, year 2003 or something, like how is this possible that people are still doing this to each other like that? So that was really, really challenging. Actually, I almost started dating the new dean of students at Dickinson. He was a Puerto Rican from New York, and a really, really amazing young man. But he had just started there that semester, and unfortunately, the reason that we didn't start dating was because he didn't return my calls. And then finally he called me and he said, I'm sorry, I really wanted to talk to you, but we really need to go out. But this first week has been crazy. And I said, what happened? He's like, well, the first semester, or the first week they had, all the frat houses had their big parties, and this poor girl got, drugged and, whatever, and almost raped, and she actually had epilepsy, so she ended up being in the hospital for like a week. And then if that wasn't enough, then he said he had to spend time talking to this, dumb kid's mother and father who were like, boys will be boys, we pay $45,000 a year for this school, just let it go, So that really is the attitude of where I come from, unfortunately. So, part of managing that kind of trauma and crisis for myself has been self-education. One of the last things I remember doing before I left Carlisle was becoming part of peer groups online. I joined like a sexual abuse survivors group for men, several different groups, but that was, I think, the most important thing for me, was that healing is not, especially when you're talking about psychological healing or self-therapy, like, you can't go to someone and have them hand you pills and hand you anything. Like, you're part of that healing. Like, you can't excuse yourself from that. The work is yours. Someone is there just to guide you and support you. And that was what was missing for me, was the support. Like, I didn't have any support at all except for what I chose to create for myself. So out of learning to do that kind of stuff online and teaching myself, how to approach, how do you find the right peer group for yourself, like how long will it take before, reading people's emails and discussions about what they've been through, do you feel comfortable really sharing what you've been through? So it took a couple of years to do that. And then actually, because my crime happened before college, I started studying that history as well, like at the historical library, what really went on, the Native American issues in Carlisle. And that inspired me to come to New Mexico out of the blue. One day I just bought a Greyhound ticket and said, "We're going here." And I came here, actually. And it was kind of like an exodus for me to leave all of that stuff behind and have a fresh start. And I was really struck when I came to New Mexico, not just because it's totally the opposite of Amish country in Pennsylvania, Aborigines and all that stuff, and mountains and green valleys, but I was really struck by the community of Las Cruces immediately as a unique place. Like, I've been homeless probably 8 or 9 times since I was 18 in different places, including Southern California when I went to meet my mom. I've been homeless in Miami. So when I was here, coming to the community of hope, it was like the first time I saw a place for homeless people. It was very impressive to see that kind of community happening and to see Las Cruces, that there's a whole campus for the homeless people. There's not just one office and then you have to take a bus that goes across town to go to the other office that can help you. It's all in one place. So that immediately was impressive to me. I actually lived at the Gospel Mission for several months before I got a job up in Silver City. The first time I came there, about 7 years ago. I even helped run the kitchen and cook. That's one of the other things I do is cook. But, living in a shelter is not ideal for anyone. It's so transitional and it's so, I don't know, especially a shelter where you're religiously, pseudo-religiously motivated to achieve something. It's not healing. You don't feel any sense of community being there. It's just people there together surviving for as long as it takes, So when I went to Silver City, I worked up there for a year, and I had a really good job in a restaurant, really cool little restaurant right on Main Street in Bullard. One of my 2 old gauges. I've been together for 14 years. And that was kind of the first time that I relaxed, and actually I think that was the first time I sang in this country since I was a teenager. They had a little wine bar where they'd have open jazz nights, so slowly I'd start to get out and do that stuff again. And then Katrina happened, and one of the ladies that used to come to the restaurant where I was a waiter